Located in Attica, New York, the Attica Correctional Facility riot is known to be one of the worst prison riots ever taken place. It's also marked as a significant uprising of the prisoners' right movement. During the summer of 1971, the state prison in Attica fumed with inmates who couldn't stand the living conditions. They were allowed to shower once a week and only have one roll of toilet paper each month. Many of the prisoners began to even view themselves as political prisoners rather than criminals. However, on the morning of September 9th, 1971, a massive eruption occurred while going to breakfast when inmates overpowered their guards and ran down a prison gallery in one giant riot. From the 2,200 inmates, about 1,000 all joined in and began rampaging through the facility, beating guards, acquiring makeshift weapons, and burning down the prison chapel. One guard, William Quinn, was severely beaten and thrown out a second-story window. 2 days later, he died in hospital from his injuries. Using tear gas and submachine guns, state police regained control of 3 of the 4 cell blocks held by rioters without loss of life. By 10:30 AM, the inmates were only in control of D Yard, a large, open exercise field surrounded by 35-foot walls and overlooked by gun towers. 39 hostages, mostly guards and a few other prison employees, were blindfolded and held in a tight circle. Inmates armed with clubs and knives guarded the hostages closely. Riot leaders put together a list of demands, including improved living conditions, more religious freedom, an end to male censorship, and expanded phone privileges. Meanwhile, hundreds of state troopers arrived in Attica, and New York Governor Nelson A. Rockefeller called in the National Guard. In tense negotiations, New York Correction Commissioner Russell Oswald agreed to honor the inmates' demands for improved living conditions. However, talks died down when the prisoners called for amnesty for everyone in D Yard, along with safe passage to a non-imperialist country for anyone who desired it. Observers pleaded with Governor Rockefeller to come to Attica as a show of good faith, but he refused and instead ordered the prison to be retaken by force. On the rainy Monday morning of September 13th, an ultimatum was read to the inmates, calling on them to surrender. They responded by putting knives against the hostages' throats. At 9:46 AM, helicopters flew over the yard, dropping tear gas as state police and correction officers stormed in with guns blazing. The police fired 3,000 rounds into the tear gas haze, killing 29 inmates and 10 of the hostages. Most were shot in the initial indiscriminate barrage of gunfire, but other prisoners were shot or killed after they surrendered. An emergency medical technician recalled seeing a wounded prisoner lying on the ground, shot several times in the head by a state trooper. Another prisoner was shot 7 times and then ordered to crawl along the ground. When he didn't move fast enough, an officer kicked him. Many others were savagely beaten. In the aftermath of the bloody raid, authorities said that inmates had killed the slain hostages by slitting their throats. One hostage was said to have been castrated. However, autopsies showed that these charges were false and that all 10 hostages had been shot to death by police. The attempted cover-up increased public condemnation of the raid and prompted a congressional investigation. The Attica uprising was the worst prison riot in US history. A total of 43 people were killed, including 39 killed in the raid, guard William Quinn, and 3 inmates killed by other prisoners early in the riot. In the weeks after its conclusion, police engaged in brutal acts against the prisoners, forcing them to run a gauntlet of nightsticks and crawl naked across broken glass, among other tortures. The many injured inmates received substandard medical treatment, if any. In 1974, lawyers representing the 1,281 inmates filed a $2.8 billion class action lawsuit against the prison and state officials. It took 18 years before the suit came to trial and 5 more years to reach the damages phase. In January 2000, New York State and the former and current inmates settled for $8 million, which was divided unevenly among about 500 inmates depending on the severity of their suffering during the raid and the weeks following. Families of the slain correction officers lost their right to sue by accepting the modest death benefit checks sent to them by the state. The hostages who survived likewise lost their right to sue by cashing their paychecks. Both groups attest that no state officials apprised them of their legal rights, and they were denied compensation that New York should have paid to them. One of the worst prison riots in history started on April 16, 1959, where prisoner Jerry Miles and his accomplices Lee Smart and George Alton gained control of the Montana State Prison in Deer Lodge. It began when inmates took rifles from the guards in both cell houses and started taking hostages. This was actually done fairly quickly and quietly while guards were being taken one by one, and within half an hour, everyone who knew a riot was taking place either died or was captured. The first casualty was Deputy Warden Ted Roth, who was murdered by Miles and Smart. Warden Floyd Powell was across the street from the prison. Miles went to tell him that there was a disturbance at the prison, and once he got inside the prison, Powell was captured by Miles and Smart and held hostage. He was forced to call Governor Aronson in Helena, but the governor wasn't in and Powell left a coded message that warned the governor of his situation without the captors knowing. Then, Powell was put under watch by inmate Walter Trocchi, who was actually ordered to kill him with a kitchen knife if the governor didn't call by 8 PM. Amazingly, Powell managed to make Trocchi give up his weapon in exchange for amnesty. He then escaped. Miles had an idea, and it was to tunnel out of the prison with no tools. However, Powell and Miles made a deal that involved a team of reporters entering the prison, taking pictures, and interviewing inmates, but nothing would be printed until the hostages were set free. At that point, Powell allowed 3 members of the media to enter and interview the inmates. But Miles then refused to release the hostages and threatened to kill them if more reporters didn't show up to cover everything. Powell refused and a standoff ensued. During the 3rd day of the riot, the Montana National Guard barged into the prison. All hostages were let out unharmed, but the riot ended with the murder-suicide of both Miles and Smart. The riot was so historic that a book named Jerry's Riot was published, involving full details of what happened in the 3-day riot. If you haven't already, I recommend the read, as it gives a great insight into not only the riots, but how prisoners were treated back in the 50s. The Strange Ways prison riot in 1990 lasted for 25 days. Located in Manchester, England, the riot began on April 1st, 1990, when prisoners took control over the prison chapel, and at that point, the riot quickly built up and spread throughout the majority of the prison. It was not only a riot, but a rooftop protest as well. The reasons for the riot had to do with overcrowding, inhumane conditions, and the mistreating of inmates. The 2 key players that created the riot were inmates Paul Taylor and Alan Lord. Once getting control of the guards, the inmates headed for the roof and started mocking and taunting the officers on the ground. At this moment, inmates began destroying the prison, setting fire to certain areas and removing parts of the roof. Even after firefighters tried to get rid of the fire and officers attempted to barge in, there were just too many rioters to control. So, the officers decided to wait. They waited for 25 days and the rioters were still on the roof, ignoring their hunger and fatigue. When officers broke into the prisons, they discovered that the place was a total disaster and would cost millions to repair. Only 1 prisoner was killed, while 147 officers and 47 prisoners were injured. Television images of prisoners sitting on the roof of the building were seen by people around the world. Paul Taylor, who started the protests, insists it was meant to be peaceful. Taylor said it was supposed to be a 24-hour sit-down protest in the chapel as a show of strength, also stating that once the protest turned violent, it was very easy. They gave up the fight. They'd never been met with such resistance before. A major inquiry into the riot was carried out by a senior judge, Lord Wolfe. His report blamed severe overcrowding and described conditions in the months leading up to the disturbances as intolerable. A major prison building program took place in an effort to solve the problem of overcrowding. However, the prison population is now double what it was in 1990, with rising violence and suicides and a reduction in the number of prison officers. Terrible prison conditions such as overcrowding, inferior services, and other reasons caused the massive New Mexico State penitentiary riot on February 2nd and 3rd, 1980. From unsanitary cells to poor quality food, and even the cancellation of education, it was no shocker that a riot occurred in the prison. On February 2nd, 1980, 2 prisoners overpowered an officer. Then, in minutes, 4 more of the 15 officers were taken hostage. At this point, a fleeing officer couldn't lock the grill between the south and north wings of the prison. The path to the control center was left wide open for inmates to enter. Inmates even got a hold of keys from an officer's belt and started releasing other inmates from their cells. They started bashing windows and doors to get into control rooms and unlock doors, grab weapons, and get more keys. At this point, murder and violence began to occur. Gangs were fighting other gangs, and inmates were beating each other up, as well as beating up officers. Then, inmates wanted to negotiate with officers, making demands for better prison conditions that included overcrowding, regaining the education system, better food, and more. They even demanded to speak with independent federal officials and members of the media. Once the inmates met with reporters, the officers who were held hostage were released. A total of 33 inmates died, and more than 200 inmates were treated for injuries. While none of the 12 officers that were taken hostage were killed, 7 of them were seriously injured from beatings and rape. Portions of the facility were destroyed, and the gymnasium was burned. Repairs cost more than $10 million, and hundreds of prisoners were shipped out of state. The Ciudad Juarez riot is last on the list of the worst prison riots ever. Located in Chihuahua, Mexico, the riot began around 7 AM on March 4, 2009 and lasted for about 2 hours. 14 members of the Aztecas controlled a prison guard with knives and stole the guard's keys. The gang started opening several cells. They released about 170 prisoners. During this moment, the prisoners forced their way into an area where meetings with family and friends occurred for visits and started attacking them. In the midst of the riot, prisoners began setting their cells on fire, stabbing each other with knives, or beating each other to death. Other prisoners managed to get their hands on rifles and iron pins to use as weapons. Plus, there were some prisoners who were thrown from the 2nd story of the prison. About 50 members of the Mexican army, 200 police officers, an airplane, and 2 helicopters were used to put the riot to an end. It was reported that about 20 people were killed and 15 injured. The riot ended up being a fight among several rival gangs involving the Barrio Azteca, Los Mexicos, and Artistas Azizonas. Hey everyone, I hope you're all well. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, all I ask is that you consider to like and subscribe. Also, did I miss out any famous riots you guys know? If so, let me know of them down below and I might make a part 2 to this. But anyway, I wish you all the best and I'll catch you in the next video. See ya.